A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We're going to be looking to try and understand the Israel-Iran conflicts and all of the other conflicts that are going on in the Middle East, and from the position of a religious dimension. How are we seeing these things through Christian eyes? So we're turning our attention to these dimensions and the dramatic developments that are going on in the Middle East, and all eyes now back on Gaza and the ruling Hamas terror organisation. As the fragile ceasefire appears to be holding with Iran, we might be wondering what religious factors are at work that may spark new conflict at any moment. Right now, in some European countries, the terror threat is increasing. As you know, Iran sponsored its proxies, including Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen. Last week, full-scale war was averted, with the dropping of those bunker-busting bombs on Iran's nuclear facilities. But what does it mean that Iranians warn of everlasting consequences? What does it mean for things like sleeper cells? An opportunity for expert insight today as we explore the dimensions of the simmering conflict between Israel and surrounding nations, and importantly, how we think as Christians trying to understand the conflict. Our special guest, Australian Christian expert on Islam, Dr. Bernie Power. From Melbourne School of Theology, Dr. Bernie Power has lived and worked in several Muslim countries over many years. He speaks and reads Arabic. He teaches the Quran, the Hadith, and Muslim thought at the Melbourne School of Theology, and he has written numerous books on the Muslim-Christian interface. Bernie Power, it's always good to have you back. A special welcome to 2020.
Great to be with you, Neil, and greetings to all your listeners.
Bernie, let's start with a fragile ceasefire. I wonder if you've got some impressions here, whether you think it might be likely to hold for now, and even if there are some understandings of religious difference that might impact that.
Yeah, well, I'm hopeful it will hold and that the fighting will stop. That's been a big issue. I'm not sure where it will go to from here. The news seems to change from day to day as new pronouncements come out of the White House about what Donald Trump might want or not want. The Israeli government is a pretty kind of tenuous situation with Benjamin Netanyahu's political future and situation being quite tenuous. Iran, there's the possibility that there may be an attempt at a regime change, the people rising up against the Iranians. And of course, militant Islam is bubbling away in the background there, so that's always a threat.
We can enlarge on a whole lot of dimensions. You raise a lot of those, even as we just start our conversation. I wonder, though, just getting into the deep end and trying to understand things a little more deeply, the way that religious tensions are in play across the Middle East, because we know that when you're looking at mainstream media or you're looking at governments dealing with things, it looks as though they're dealing with things at a government level and a war level and trying to contain peace or maintain peace or create peace. But there's religious dimensions in all of this that so often go under the radar. What are your thoughts here about the sorts of relationships between Islamists and the Jews and even the divisions between the Islamic side, the Shias and the Sunnis? Give us your insights here.
Yeah, certainly. And it's great that you raised that issue because, as you say, most of the media looks at the world from a geopolitical perspective rather than thinking about the issues behind it. And of course, as Christians, we understand that there is an unseen world and there are all kinds of forces that are happening in that, but also ideological ones. So within Islam, we see these divisions. There's quite radical Islam, and other variations of it, but also the Sunni and the Shia divisions as well. So they're an important part of it. And we're seeing that play out, and even like within Israel, we're seeing some kind of divisions there. The country is not all at one, so where there are protests out in the street and other things that are happening there as well.
You know, you raise such an important point because our Christian lens takes us not into just understanding ideological divisions between religious mindsets, but also to the fact that there is a bigger spiritual war at play here. And oftentimes that's not even discussed at all, and certainly when you've just got a geopolitical debate going along. But the spiritual forces at work here, have you got an impression on how we might understand those?
Yeah, and I think at its base there is this real antipathy that Islam holds towards Judaism and towards the Jewish people. That's not something new. People say, oh, yeah, it's all because of 1948. In fact, this division or this dislike, it comes right from the very time of Muhammad, 1400 years ago, when Muhammad, as he went into Medina to take the message of Islam in there, the Jews of that time opposed him. And so he then made some very negative statements about the Jews, which are recorded in the Quran. So they're called monkeys and pigs. They're described as the worst of people. They can't be trusted. They're cowards. There's a whole lot of teaching in the Quran that's very anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. And over the centuries, the Muslim communities have picked that up and continued to work with that. And 1948 brought it all to a focus where a group of Jews came into land which had previously been controlled by the Muslims for 1400 years in Israel and Palestine, and they began establishing their settlements and then ultimately a Jewish state. And that's been a terrible kind of thing in terms of the Jewish understanding of how history should work out.
You know, when we reflect on Muhammad, and as you say, he made negative statements 1400 years ago, and the fact that those Islamic writings are based on Muhammad, those things are held religiously of the highest value by people who are in Islam. So is it possible that none of these sorts of issues between Jews and Islam can ever be resolved? They have to be managed?
Yeah. Throughout history, Muslim people have responded to Jews in different ways. So at times, Jewish people have been quite accepted in society. At times, there was a Jewish grand vizier for an Islamic empire. So that's always been borne out there in practice. But the texts are there, and it's really, if a person wants to find a reason for their opposition to the Jews from a Muslim perspective, they've got plenty of material that they could work with. And Muhammad himself said the end times won't come until there is the rocks and the trees call out to the Muslims, "O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him." And so Muhammad saw this kind of opposition to the Jews as something that would last right through until the final day.
An everlasting hatred between Jews and the Islamists. Is there, now here's, taking us perhaps into the deep end here, when we can identify hatred that you might say from the Islamist side to the Jewish side, is there a foundation in any Jewish scriptures for hatred the opposite way? I'm throwing you in the deep end here because, obviously Christians, we have an affinity with the Jewish people because we share the Old Testament. But is there something that is claimed that gives an everlasting hatred from the Jewish side to the Islamists?
Certainly not in the scriptures, because Islam hadn't come into being when the Old Testament was written. So historically it came when the Muslims first invaded the Jewish lands shortly after the death of Muhammad. And the Jews wrote about Islam generally as a negative force. And one of their greatest thinkers, a guy called Moses Maimonides, he's probably the equivalent to John Calvin in Christian thinking, or maybe Thomas Aquinas or Augustine. Great thinker, and he said the Muslims have done more damage to us than any other people. And he himself fled from Spain because they told the Jewish people there, you must either convert to Islam or be killed, or you can leave. And his family took the decision to leave. So there's that real sense of that antipathy between the two communities that's been there for a long time.
And if we talk about things that go back into Old Testament times, Isaac and Ishmael, who's the chosen one from Abraham? Who are the chosen people? Is this an ongoing, long debate too that you can't understand without a religious lens here?
Yeah, certainly. And the Arabs would claim their descent from Ishmael, so the Abraham's son, the son that he had through through Hagar. And the Bible very clearly says that the promise would come through Isaac, through the other son, the son that was born through Sarah. And so just as in their lifetime there was antipathy between the two, there's a prophecy in Genesis which says about Ishmael, he'll be a wild donkey of a man, his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. And so Ishmael was the one who went out into the desert, he became a warrior, a fighter, and so we see that kind of belligerent tone that became a part of the ongoing civilization that was built.
This is 2020 with Neil Johnson, helping you make sense of life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision Christian Radio.
Bernie, let me ask you about the ongoing threat that so many have been concerned could be growing after the ceasefire deal with Iran, and that is the potential for sleeper cells. The idea that there would be terror cells that are implanted in nations around the world that all of a sudden can spring to life and cause all sorts of misery. Is this a relevant thing to be thinking about, do you think?
Yeah, it's certainly been an issue, and if you talk to people like ASIO and other security groups, they're quite aware of the danger of the radical Islamist groups. Of I think the 30 organisations, terrorist organisations classified by ASIO in Australia, 28 of them are Islamic ones. And when you talk with them, they say, oh yeah, we realise that this is where the threat will come from.
Why do you think political leaders appear to be ignorant around some of the issues to do with the religious differences? Are there advisors, do you think, at higher levels that are helping our political leaders understand the religious dimensions? Are you aware of any of those?
Yes, certainly that would be part of it. Sometimes the leaders may not be aware of the issues, or sometimes they are aware, but they're also aware of the fact that they'll be coming up for election every couple of years. And in some seats in Australia, there are significant Muslim majorities where they would need to win seats, for example, in Western Sydney, northern suburbs of Melbourne, and some Muslim groups are organising themselves into voting blocks, and so they're kind of putting an implied threat to the government that we can remove your people from Parliament by running our own candidates. So that's happening.
Stay with these sleeper cells and our governments for a few moments. As I understand it, there's no increase in alertedness here in Australia around sleeper cells. Does that mean that our intelligence is good? Sometimes we think about radicalisation, and I've had people on this program, and it might have even been you, but saying that radicalisation can happen in an instant, and what might seem peaceful now could actually erupt into something very disastrous. So far as our governments are concerned, and the thought of even sleeper cells here in Australia, is this something that people are asking you about?
Yes, and I've talked with some of the security forces about stuff. They've asked me to pass on information as I come across it. They're quite aware of the threat and what's going on. So, I mentioned the 30 organisations that have been banned as terrorist organisations, 28 of them being Muslim ones. There's been about a dozen Islamic terrorist attacks in Australia that have resulted in deaths or injuries. But beyond that, there's 60 plus other people, Muslim people, that are in prison that have been charged with or convicted of attempting terrorist plots. And these are all ones that have been thwarted. So the security forces, ASIO and the police are watching, and they have special units who are watching these groups and keeping on top of that, which is why I think we haven't had an attack in Australia in recent years. Well, we have had a couple. So we had this 15-year-old boy in Perth, the boy in Sydney, and they have been radicalised, as you say, very quickly and often online. So it's been difficult for the police to keep on top of that. They can't watch what everybody's watching, and the people will come out and they'll perform an act, and they may not have had any connection with other organisations. So that's quite difficult for people to track down.
I'm aware that in the US they've been on some extra alert for the potential for these sleeper cells. Just before our conversation just a short while back, I thought I'd do a quick search and see what European countries are concerned there. And while I don't have an overall expression of what European countries are doing, I know that in Hungary they've got a higher anticipation of the possibility of some level of terror. Are there particular places around the world that might be more risky than others? If you were reflecting on the US or on Europe?
Yeah, certainly. Like France would be the place which has got in Europe would be the place with the most potential for danger, partly because they've got the highest proportion of Muslims of any European country. I think it might be up to about 12% now, something like that. And so they've got this very large population, and they'll often live in kind of ghetto situations. They become like ideological wells that people only ever hear the kind of the radical Islamic narrative, and so that's where you're most likely to get the dangers happening.
Let me ask you, Bernie, because this is a passion of yours. As an Australian Christian expert on Islam, you spend time on the streets. You're meeting with people who come from an Islamic background, and you might be reflecting on things that are going on around the world. As I understand it, the growth of Christianity in places like Iran is huge. When those sorts of things become apparent to people, even on our streets here in Australia, what sort of effect is that having? Are you noticing there's an openness to the gospel?
Yeah, again, it depends. So like with Muslims, I always talk about Islam being a continuum, a spectrum. So you'll have the radical ones, and they're often the people. So we have our tables in the street, and the radical Muslims have their tables, and they're not interested in learning or understanding or knowing. On the other end of the spectrum, I've just had a couple of phone calls in the last few days from young people who have become Christians from Muslim backgrounds and facing a difficult time because of that. And in the middle, there would be a whole lot of very kind of traditional and often liberal Muslims who would carry Islam as their badge, but really they don't do anything about it. So you've got all of that range of views happening within the Muslim community. And there is certainly amongst younger people often a greater openness to Christianity, and we're seeing these conversions happening.
And very quickly, because it's almost news time, the thing that motivates you is your love and appreciation for Muslim people. You're bringing a Christian gospel, and some will no doubt think that that's antagonistic, but do they see that love, in you and in your teams that you've got on the streets?
Well, we hope so, and we try to project it, because we'll tell them that, we're out here because we love you and God loves you, and we want you to know that the best message that you could possibly hear. They may not always take it that way. They can be the radical ones can be quite belligerent and aggressive. And we cope with that, and we tell them, well, we can put forward our ideas. It's up to you whether you want to accept it and accept the gospel.
Bernie, let's get this part of our conversation a little bit focused on what might be some pathways that could happen from here in the Middle East. And we might be reflecting on good things that could happen or bad. What are you thinking about?
Yeah, so we're at an interesting point in the deliberations at the moment. So the recent bombings in Iran have put on notice the Iranians that America is not afraid to use lethal force and their military arm to enforce the things. And that's kind of put the Iranians on the back foot a bit. there, and other groups as well, so other Islamic groups. So they're a little bit more wary than they would have been under a different kind of a US administration. Support for the Israel from the Trump administration has really emboldened them, and Netanyahu has really had a bit of a boost in the polls. He's been very unpopular prior to this. He's been down in the low 30s, who's now moved up into the high 30s in terms of approval rating, and he may possibly call a snap election so he can get rid of some of the more right-wing parties within his coalition and establish a stronger base, and then negotiate with the Hamas on the basis of that.
What are your impressions? And we might be able to just get a brief impression and maybe even enlarge on it. People talk about a two-state solution, and there are implications for that. What impressions around a two-state solution, the possibilities or the impossibilities?
Yeah, it's interesting that was kind of always put forward as this would be the best solution, because we've got approximately equal numbers of Jews and Palestinians living within the land of Israel and Palestine. It's about 7 or 8 million each. And they really find it difficult to live together. So the two-state solution was put forward by the UN a long time ago, back in the 1940s, as a possible solution to that. But it hasn't worked out very well for them. Gaza has been a sore point. You've got all the radical groups within Islam that are pushing their own agendas. The Palestinian Authority is very weak and they're kind of sidelined. So it's really hard for the Palestinians to present a united front. You get similar kind of thing within Israel. There's also fair divisions within that. So it's really hard to see how you can get a two-state solution with two kind of relatively weaker organisations or governments trying to negotiate with each other.
I've got a question here on a text from Sophie in Melbourne. Sophie says, as a young person, I have friends who support the Free Palestine movement very strongly, including other Christian friends. What is the best way to engage in healthy discussion on the topic when it's difficult to find unbiased information on the subject? That's Sophie in Melbourne. What are your thoughts here?
Street on Saturday, I was asked by some Muslims, so which side are you on? Are you with the Palestinians or are you with the Jews? And I said, I'm on Jesus' side. I said, I think, with neither of them will come out with a perfect solution to their situation. They're going to be fighting with each other. And Jesus is the one who comes into that situation as a peacemaker. And he's the one who can bring people together who were natural enemies and reconcile them. So I'd say that's what I would see as the ultimate situation, the ultimate solution.
So for Sophie and her Christian friends supporting a Free Palestine movement, and of course there are all sorts of things. There's even been big developments on the weekend, hasn't there? I don't know whether you caught some things that have come out of the Glastonbury Music Festival, but even new ways of chanting anti-Israel, anti-Semitic things. For Sophie, clearly she's the meat and the sandwich here, and she wants to do the best thing by her friends. So you think just claim that I'm on Jesus' side is a way that actually diffuses the heat? Is that the way it works?
Yeah, and like if we come down on one side or the other, then people will be, we'll lose our audience. People will stop listening to us. If you take a very strong pro-Palestinian line, then a lot of people, certainly from the Jewish community, will say, well, not going to take any notice of you. And the left has really picked up on this Palestinian, the Free Palestine thing. So we had a guy outside the State Library the other day. I was chatting to him, and periodically he'd yell out, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." But I don't think he realised the implications of that statement. And it is basically that the Jews will be forced out of the land, and they'll have to go and live somewhere else. So it's really a complex thing, and I don't think there's a kind of a simple political solution to it. but I think we need to do whatever we can to get involved in that and make sure it happens.
And of course, being people of the book, Old and New Testament, the Christian believer has a tendency, don't we, to be in rock-solid solidarity with our Jewish brothers and sisters, as seeing the Jewish people as God's chosen people and his chosen people in the land. This brings us to something I think which is pretty important, because here we are as Christians and we say Jesus is our Messiah. You have the Jewish people saying we're waiting for the return of the Messiah. And then you even have an Islamic way of thinking about Jesus and what his role might be. Is this something that is, eschatological? It's a way that things are coming to a head. I wonder if you've got any reflection here on how we see Jesus in the midst of all of the conflict that's going on. Is this an end times issue?
Yeah, so it's interesting. On the Islamic table in the city, we have our has John 14:6. Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me." And the Muslim table on the street there says, "Jesus is a Muslim." So they're kind of claiming Jesus for themselves. And, we'd say, well, you might call him a Muslim, but it's not the same Jesus that we're talking about, not the same Jesus in the Bible. And from the Jewish perspective, I think it's important to recognise we would support and the teaching in the Bible about the Jews turning to Christ, that we see in Romans 11 as an important thing, that, the branches will be regrafted in just as we've been regrafted in, and to separate that from the political decision making that might be going on. So we wouldn't say we have to. We would support and love the Jewish people, and I've spoken at Jewish meetings here in Melbourne, but that doesn't mean that we have to support everything that the political Jewish government does. There can be a separation between that because they may not be following the teachings of the Torah themselves. They may not be faithful to that, and we can call that out just as Jesus did, just as the Old Testament prophets did, to call out where we see people's disobedience and name it as that.
We're taking calls on 1800 316 316, and you can send us a text on 0447 488 316. Let's take a call. Chris is in Melbourne. Hello, Chris. Welcome.
Hello, Neil and Bernie. Yeah, thanks. I think Bernie just made a good statement there. Like, not all the Jews follow the Torah. A lot of which I term the synagogue of Satan, because the Bible terms it, that they follow the Kabbalah and, they want the Noahide laws in. But the main thing to remember, like with the Jews and Christians and even the Muslims, is the one thing, the Abrahamic covenant. God's promised to bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse them. So anytime someone, says free Palestine, I always say, well, good on you for cursing yourself, so...
Get your thoughts here, Bernie, for Chris.
That's a good insight, and the Christian teaching about dealing with people who disagree with you is Jesus says, love your enemies and do good to those who persecute you. The normal human response is we fight and oppose and curse those who differ from us and those who are opposed to us. So I think that's an important point to bring up, that from a Christian perspective, we have a completely different approach, and the idea of loving your enemies and doing good for them is something that Jesus taught, which is not found in any other religion.
Chris, anything further to add?
No, thank you very much, Neil. Thank you.
Okay, Chris in Melbourne, 1800 316 316 to join in our conversation. Let's just hover around this for a moment here, Bernie, because having critique of Israel, as you say, and I think when you think this through a little deeply, you realise that Nobody's beyond reproach, and critique is sometimes necessary. But just to clarify here, because you say critique around issues as to whether the Israelites actually are obedient to the Torah, because sometimes other criticisms can be seen as a support for the Islamists. So you've got to be cautious in the way that you make any sort of criticism, haven't you?
Oh, really? And people are constantly trying to drag you into one camp or another. You either, totally support Israel and you won't allow any kind of criticism within it. And again, I don't think that's a biblical situation, because in the Bible we find a lot of criticism of the people of Israel when they were not faithful. And the others would say, well, if you stand for human rights and for justice, therefore you must support Palestine. And say, well, not when we have a look at some of the things that Hamas is doing and what Islamists are doing around the world, there's no way that we can say that we would support those. So to try and hold that middle position of being Christ-centered rather than buying into the narrative of one particular party, I think is an important one.
Be Christ-centred. 1-800-316-316 to join the conversation. Let's take another call. Robert is in Mossvale in New South Wales. Hey, Robert, welcome.
Thank you, Neil. Thanks for taking my call. It's interesting that we talk about what do we do with the enemies and what would Jesus have done. And I go to a Bible study on Monday nights, and it was all about prayer and forgiveness. And I jokingly said that I have 7 grandchildren in Israel, 7 grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren. I currently have the youngest grandson is a paratrooper fighting in Gaza, causing his mother a lot of grief. But nonetheless, she's a tough Australian girl, and she's hanging in there as best she can. What God put on my heart, and I jokingly said to them, look, since the war started, I had been torn on how to pray. And sometimes I pray, kill them all, God, and other times I pray, Lord, forgive them all. And I don't mean any of them. I mean, to ask God to kill people is never going to happen. But on last Monday night, forgiveness came up, and God laid it on me. I had to leave the room because He said to me, "You must forgive them, Rob. You can't joke about this. This is a serious thing. You must forgive them." I left the room. I cried out to God in the corner down the back of the church, and I was in tears. But God put it to me that you must forgive them, because they don't know what they do. They are still...
Robert, great insights here, and I'm going to be interested in Bernie's response here, because, if I'm just qualifying some of that, I can read the Psalms, and I can see all sorts of things that might say, Lord, do away with my enemies. But let's get
I really do.
Robert, let's get a thought from Bernie. Bernie, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Rob, for that. And I agree with you. Look, I just get so frustrated when I look at it. And it would be nice if there was just a very clear kind of, well, these guys are so bad that, we need to just do everything, including destroy them. And these guys are so good that we have to be on their side, to be on the side of righteousness. And of course, we know life is never like that. You're always going to get this mixture of good and bad in all of the situations. We're all created in the image of God and yet fallen from what He's called us to be. But the other aspect is just from a personal perspective, we need to forgive people and love them. But from a political perspective, there is also a need to maintain order and peace and security within your society. And so, for example, the leader of a country may send his country into war, as Benjamin Netanyahu did, out of a sense of defending the country, because if you don't, then evil will simply wash over the country and destroy everyone in it. And, Paul talks in Romans 11 about the ruler who does not bear the sword, Romans 12, he does not bear the sword in vain, and his job there is to restrain the evildoers And so, if you've got people serving in the armed forces defending their country, I think that's a good thing, because we do want to maintain peace against the groups that would want to destroy us. And Hamas they've made no secret of the fact that they want to see Israel destroyed. I was just looking at a quote here from Yasser Arafat, who wasn't a member of Hamas, who was a very secular kind of thing. He says at a speech that he gave, actually in Stockholm, he said, "You understand that we plan to eliminate the state of Israel and establish a purely Palestinian state. I have no use for Jews. They are and remain Jews, and we need to get help from you in our battle for a united Palestine under total Arab Muslim domination." And the Hamas Charter has the same kind of thing, that we want to see an Islamic rule established, and that will mean the destruction, the elimination of all the Jewish people. So you have a sense you have a right and responsibility to take up arms to protect yourself, but from your heart there can still be a kind of a forgiveness and even a love that goes beyond that, and it's hard holding those two. It would be in a simpler world if you just hated everybody that was good and everybody that was bad, and loved everybody that was good. But there's always that mixture going on there.
Yeah,
Robert, anything further to add?
Yes, I have. Just remembering that Gaza had been given back to the Palestinians. It was a sovereign country that invaded Israel. They invaded Israel. Israel didn't invade them. They invaded Israel. And we must always remember that. And the river to the sea is what they all want. But and for me, for God, for my relationship with God, my answer was a personal one. It's what God gave me to endure with.
Robert, I appreciate the sentiment, and sometimes when I'm boiling it all down and trying to understand these myself, I sometimes think, of course, as a Christian believer, saved by grace, we live a life walking in levels of forgiveness, but you can't govern a nation by grace. You have to govern a nation by war. My little way of boiling things down. But Robert, thank you so much for your insight today. Let's see if we can squeeze in some extra calls. Sue is in Kingston in Tasmania. Need to be quick, Sue, but what are your thoughts?
I actually want to ask Bernie a question, if I may, in respect to Bernie saying that Jesus is the Islamic Jesus is not the Jesus of the Bible. When Muhammad was very critical, and he is very critical in the Quran, of the Jewish rabbis and monks who were deceptive and robbed the people. And so he was, as far as I understand, referring to Jesus, but the understanding through Islam is different to us as Christians.
Good point here, Sue. Bernie, the difference between how we see Jesus and how Islamists see Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly the Quran is very positive about Jesus. It presents him as, the one who's the miracle worker, the one who creates, the one who was a kind person, who cared for others, raised people from the dead. They call him the Word of God. They called him a spirit from God. So you don't find anything except a denial. Well, there's a denial about his sonship. And I'd say, well, obviously, if you don't believe he's the Son of God, you're talking about a different Jesus. And also a denial of his death. And say for you don't believe Jesus died and rose again, then you're not talking about the same Jesus. So I think it's important when we're talking with Muslims to raise those issues and say, well, I'd never say, we all believe in the same God or we all believe in the same Jesus, because the differences between the two are very clear. And I think this is one of the issues that's going on in this whole Middle Eastern issue, where Muslims have an understanding of Allah, of God, that they're trying to project. And that tends to come out expressed in ways that we would find very unhelpful.
And I imagine that as we get to know the real image of Jesus, we can easily then discern where there are images that are missing the mark. Sue, thank you so much for your call. I'll let you go because I'm going to try and squeeze in one more call before we have to say goodbye to our guest. Thank you so much, Sue. Let's take one more call. Al is in Gladstone in Queensland. Al, welcome.
Hi.
Hey, Al. What are your thoughts here?
Well, most people don't realise that it was Israel who committed 9/11. That they rigged it for with the thermite demolition charges that took it down, and they silenced all the mainstream media who was arguing that there's no way any plane crash could have caused those buildings to implode.
Al, I think we're under a conspiracy theory here, but let's get Bernie's thoughts. Bernie, is there any relevance to the story?
Yeah, I don't think so, because there were Jews that were actually inside the buildings that were killed, and they weren't all told to leave, as some people have claimed that they were, because we have the lists of the names of them. I don't hold this kind of view that neo conspiracy that they are the source of evil in the world and they control the whole world. That I don't find the evidence for that's very strong.
Al in Gladstone, thank you so much for your call. And time is running out quickly. Bernie, just great insights today, as always. Some listeners will be saying, where do I go to find more insights like this? Because you bring such clarity. I know that you've written a whole bunch of books, one called Understanding Jesus and Muhammad, another one called Engaging Islamic Traditions, Challenging Islamic Traditions, and you've got a book called Storytellers. Is there anything that is there a latest book since I've spoken to you last? Have you got anything for listeners so far as resources around the sorts of things we're talking about?
Mm-hmm. I do have a website, berniepower.com, and I've got a whole lot of video lectures and material on that and other resources, and particularly the stuff that we would use in our outreach to Muslims on the street. So that's all accessible there.
That will be a tremendous resource for listeners, and you've been challenged by some of the things we've been talking about. berniepower.com. You can also connect with Bernie through the mst.edu.au website. That MST stands for Melbourne School of Theology. Bernie has worked for many years in Muslim nations. He teaches the Quran, the Hadith and Muslim thought at the Melbourne School of Theology, and check out some of those books, but berniepower.com. And for those listeners thinking, how do I communicate with the Muslims in my street? There might be some wonderful resource there. Bernie, you teach courses on evangelism. You're going to be taking a team to West Africa in January. You keep on with your street evangelism on the streets in Melbourne. Is there a particular place that you can you gather together with your team? Is there something for Melbourne listeners they might be able to get on side?
So maybe if they can contact me through MST. So we're on Burke Street outside the State Library, on Swanson Street outside the State Library, on corner of Burke and Swanson, and outside Flinders Street Station. So any Saturday, you can come along there and see members from our table and encourage them along and maybe even join us.
A wonderful way to engage. berniepower.com or mst.edu.au. Bernie, thanks so much for sharing your heart with us once again today on 2020.
Thanks so much. Great to be with you.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.